Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back in Forum of National Intelligence Estimates. Today's topics we will discuss about narrative of Papuan issues in international diplomacy and media. As far as we know that there are many narratives of pre-Papuan movement abroad, which lead to the international community's issues. This matter has concerned the government of Indonesia, and it needs to be taken. The statement that circulating in international media and global forums must be able to be answered by the government. Then what are the strategic steps that can be taken by Indonesia in responding to this? Today, with me, we have our speaker, Professor Dr. Kusnanto Anggoro.
Thank you so much, Bung Adrian, for giving me an opportunity to observe a lot of issues, especially in relation with Papuan issues, narrative and international diplomacy and international politics. It is really very important subject for many reasons, considering the impact of globalization, development of technology, social media, as well as another issues, this one. Technology in relation with kind of social media, of course, has already made some narrative become something like asymmetric weapon during the time of war. That's why we must actually respond quite adequately. However, we must also taking into account a couple of issues, irrespective of the dictions that they are using in international diplomacy. There is much more important issues to be taken into account, especially with substance. And when we are discussing about Papuan issues, the substance sometimes was misguided, not only because of it is very political, but at the same time, also because data is not easily adequate, especially for someone who's living beyond Indonesian border, the foreigner, the non-governmental organization activist, the academic, the scholar, or even the diplomat. Not many people actually understand what actually happening on the ground. And in most cases, actually the data that has been became a standpoint of making a discussion is an old one. The most popular, if I may mention, is the road to the Papuan uprising. It is indeed that the book was published officially in 2020, but the data inside the book was in fact relies on old research that organized sometime between 1978 to 1998. And it is very important to understand that after 1998, Indonesia has changed so much in almost many dimensions of politics, of diplomacy, of law and regulation, and including on how actually to exercise human right protection as well as handling the human right violation. The military, the most important actor within that context, at least according to many allegations from the outside border of Indonesia, has already enjoyed some reform, which is very significant reform. So by this introduction, I just would like to continue with a couple of questions, and in fact also a couple of substantial issues. The first issues to be dealing with is perhaps about self-discrimination. And later we are going to also project some discussion about the second issues, which basically about human rights, whether we can handle the kind of human right violation, a human right law, or to what extent actually Indonesia capable of handling the kind of issue. The third would be related in many issues, more wider context within the Indonesian reform, some element of change and continuity which we already have, for example. We must remember that reforms in the beginning of the year of 2000 has touched so many wide issues. One cannot forget what happening in Indonesia during Suharto era, of course, yes. But after the demise of Suharto in 1999, at least during the last 20 years, there are already a lot of reform that we are actually exercising. In the case of human rights, for example, we already established the National Committee for Human Rights in 1999. We have law on human rights in 1999. We already set up the what so-called as a human rights court or something on the year of 2000. That as far as human rights is concerned. Beyond that, political reform is also the second most important point. We understand that central and local relations during Suharto era is so much different. They adopting draconian law. What we have been practicing during the last 20 years is in fact very much different. Just look at what actually we already done and related with, for example, the law on regional autonomy. The first one we already have in 1999, then revised in 2002. We have again in 2005, and the last one we have in 2014. That is basically changed the landmark between the relationship of central government and local government, including between Jakarta and between Papua. And the Papuan is enjoying a lot of issues, especially related with regional autonomization and so on and so forth. And the third, we cannot forget, reform as far as military is concerned. It might not be sufficient, but I think we go that far. It's very different. The role of the military under law number 3, 2002, with role of the military that they used to taking place sometime under Suharto era. Military operations is also different. It's very different. Yes, indeed, there are 15 military operations, but we are remembering correctly and how to analyze this one further. Then, in fact, the military operation is end already in 1998. And the last military operation we did it between 1992 to 1998. In fact, there is no longer attached to what so-called as military operation, but much more related with how the military, in fact, supporting local government, supporting the national police, and so on and so forth. So the military is not alone with that kind of stuff. I think within that particular context, it's also important to be taken into account before we are going to discuss about the substance. Do not forget that exchange is also happening at the international fora. The issues remain there for quite a while, but international fora are also changing. So this would be taken into account, especially when we are discussing the relationship between the activists and non-governmental organization effort outside Indonesian border and how they relate, especially with the politicians there and so on and so forth, is very important. Because without discussing this kind of thing, we cannot actually understand what kind of substance actually we are going to bring at the diplomatic level. And if we do not knowing about that substance, it would be very difficult actually we have to discuss almost everything. So first issues that we are going to rethink is basically about the New York Agreement 1992 and then Act of Free Choice 1999 as well as United Nations Resolution 2504. That is actually the basic legitimacy for what happening since 1970s, in which the Papuan is becoming integrated part of Indonesia. Many people of course, is not very happy. They're accusing that all those things is basically illegitimate. We can discuss this one, whether it's really legitimacy or not. What many people probably forgetting is the contact within the elections or Act of Free Choice in 1969. What we do know now is possibly the election in United States. You can watch what's happening in Washington. You can watch what's happening in London. You can watch what's happening in New Delhi and everywhere around the globe because communication is very good. To deliver election logistical support is very easy now. 15 years ago, the situation is very different. We must take into account these differences to put into account whether that kind of process actually legitimize the democratic process during that time. Second issues, just please do remember about the cultural dimension of democracy. Do you think that Papuan culture of representations is similar to Washington culture, Moscow culture, Beijing culture, or even Ankara culture in Turkey? No, it's not. If we are imagining what now, then situation is very simple. because the availability of technology, availability of information, and the possibility of political parties to bring campaign and so on, then it's quite easy. 15 years ago, Papuan was very strong with tribal culture, and everybody know, within the context of tribal culture, representation cannot actually democratic representation as we know it in liberal tenet. So if we are considering all those things, we understand that the best that we can possibly did in 1969 was act of free choice. Irrespective they involve only just a couple hundred person, but during context of that time, it is legitimate. Or if you don't like the word legitimacy, perhaps we can justify that that is actually legal and could becoming a political landmark as well as a foundation for then Papua can possibly go. Two is the issues of human rights issues. I just would like to emphasize this one, that there are differences between human rights issues and human rights law. We have a lot of human rights issues, not only in Indonesia, even in modern democracy. In the United States, just remember what's happening with Black Lives Matter. Just remember what the United States done with the Indian. It was also the remain serious case in Australia, especially in relation between the Aborigine. Of course, it's still a serious matter in China, considering what's happening in Tibet, in Xinjiang, or even in Hong Kong. So basically, this is issues, but not every issues can be brought about into legal process. It depends on a couple of circumstances. One, whether there are instruments at the national level. And as I mentioned before, we do have many instruments as far as Indonesia is concerned. Again, we have human rights law of the year 2000, we have human rights court in 2000, and so on and so on. It is a different question whether that instrument is sufficient or not within the international context, but we do have. You must underline what point actually I emphasize is, because if we have problem in relation with human rights violation, but if at the same time we can handle it, you cannot internationalize the issues. That about human rights issues, which is very important actually to be taken into account. The third issues is basically on the issues of, I don't know how to say this one, it's very delicate issues, but basically it's related with whether the issues is fundamental enough to become a principle and norm, or whether the issues is nothing more than the issues of governance, the way institutional setup and institutional bureaucracies could handle that kind of problem. The case in point is we have what in the West very much reiterated with relation with something like extrajudicial killing, something like that, which is very important. But according to me, and considering political landscape and political situation in Indonesia, again, within the context of how law has already transformed during the last 2 years, 20 years, then it is very important to reconsider it actually about what so-called extrajudicial killing and so forth. Just look at what's happening in Papua, for example. As I mentioned earlier in my introduction, that the source that frequently quoted by NGO activists, by politicians, and by academics, and then they circulated quite widely on the media as well as on the academic writing, was research that in fact already exercised sometime between 1978 to 1992. So we possibly also found something that the casualty in Papua is between 100,000, 150,000. As an academic, I don't really understand. It's the wide range between 100,000 to 500,000. The second question, how long actually this casualty is taking place? In a year or in 50 years? Because actually Papua has already been in part of Indonesia in almost 50 years. The answer to that question, it could be different. In fact, if you are looking at for another publication, again also circulating in the West, for example, by Bob Anderson. It was published in Hawaii University entitled Insecurity Papua. You may have a really different picture because the casualties account more differentiated way. In fact, as far as Papua is concerned, 31% out of the casualty that happening in Papua was due basically to domestic violence. 17% is related directly or otherwise with vigilantism. 23% are related in one way or another with other issues. Make a guess. How many percent actually? Casualties related in political assassination or in political identity. Political assassination 2% only, and the conflict related with identity issues is in fact nothing more than 3%. So this picture is very important because if everything is taken into consideration, I don't think that someone could possibly politicize the casualties or the number of casualties that are becoming a victim within Papua under Indonesia during the last 50 years. Just also please to reconsider a lot of things, including, for example, you can use data. One of the most probably easily available is fragile state index. You can look at two indicators. One is group grievances, and two is human rights and law enforcement index. You can just make any comparison. What Indonesia has achieved during the last 10 years, between 2010 and 2020, and just look at what other countries are capable of doing. According to my observation, based on that data, I found, interestingly, that what Indonesia has performed better than anybody else on the globe, especially when we are referring to developing countries. The second data that's also important is that about internal violence index. We can see what happened in Indonesia, in Myanmar, in the Philippines, in Thailand, and India, and even in Turkey. Just remember, Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand, India, and Turkey was a country that also at the same time confronting, like the case that we have, Papua. It's up to you what you call about Papua, violent conflict, terrorism, separatism, or whatever. It is interesting to note that based on the data, the index of internal violence is 13.95. What do you think about the number? Is it high or low? I just would like to tell you that in fact, the 13.95 is very low. Just make it in comparison with Myanmar, for example, where the index is 27.19, or with the Philippines, 35.50, or with the Thailand, 37.93, or with the Indian modern democracies, at least according to democratic index. Do you know how much the index? 44.91. With Turkey, 36.95. That gives opportunity for rethinking that what we achieve in Indonesia in dealing with Papuan issue, substantive issue, especially with casualties and so on and so forth, is actually not bad, or I would say actually the best among a couple of countries. Of course, the terminology like extrajudicial killing and so on, it could be problematic, because even from a particular perspective, I believe murder, even only one, is illegitimate and against human rights. But the question is whether it is something that against human rights should be passed through into more human rights institutions, like for example, International Court of Justice, or even UN resolution. It is legitimate enough to bring all those kind of things into self-determination issue and up with independent state of Papua? The answer is no. Indonesia has performed very good, especially on human rights issue. Our index is 76, which is actually better than the Malaysian, or on the rank of 66. And the Philippines, 33, and Thailand, 31, in Turkey, 25, in Iraq, 36, and India, 37. We're not that bad. Do you think that the international community will accept to bring all kind of issues? The answer is no. The possibility is very difficult, that one. Of course, reform is incomplete. It's ongoing. It has been 20 years, and we do need Indonesia possibly for another 10 or 15 years. But I am sure that we will eventually capable of handling that kind of fun. As far as military reform of concern, for example, law number 34, 2004, is already 30 years, and many people already have a thinking to revise that kind of incident. Just please do think what the newly elected commander of the Indonesian military undercover Perkasa have been doing between 2015 to 2017 by strategy of bottom up, and he basically already devised a new operations, how a standard operating procedure, something like that. The military will be conducting some operation in Papua as well as in another group. I'm sure this Indonesia going to be better, and our treatment of Papua is going to be better. That's for the sake of the Papuan, for Indonesia, and for regional order. The bringing up the issue of self-determination, well, you can do that at the political level. You can do that. I have no reservation as far as philosophical is concerned. But if you are looking at what kind of opportunity we have, then that possibility is not quite big. What would you imagine if, for example, Southern Thailand becoming an independent state? Do you think that security in South Asia will not a new turbulence? What possibility might be happening if Tibet and Xinjiang became separate from China? Would you think that Central Asia would not be in another turmoil after withdrawal of America from Afghanistan? Just imagine what might be thinking if the Catalans are becoming independent countries. European would become. What is the spin-off effect? Southern France is the neck, I'm sure. The German in Bavarian is German with the neck. And within that particular context, I think wise diplomat would take into account for their own sake, their own stability in their country, and for the sake of stability and order, prosperity of people, to rethink about this self-determination becoming the issues. And I think within that particular background, then revoking UN Resolution 2504 is, well, I would say it's impossibility. Impossibility, I would say that's one. That is what I can say. Hopefully that I present some important issues that can be followed through in the possible discussion or question and answer that follow. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for comprehensive presentation by Dr. Kusnanto. And I would like to ask you some question regarding self-determination. It is possible for the international communities of...
Maybe, but of course it's going to be a different kind of self-determination. Not only within the particular context and concept, but also the eventual instrumental how the self-determination would be exercised in the international fora. Why was that? Because if you are looking at more carefully, the conception of self-determination has going through at least 3 stages. First generation of this self-determination theory basically starts for sometime interwar period, and that in Europe especially, then creation of the country like Austria, Hungary, and some other countries in Europe. That basically based on people's right. The second generation of self-determination end up with decolonization, basically after the Second World War until mid-1960s. The very basis of decolonization is basically against a colonial government or former colonial, and then country or state becoming independent. That's what's happening in the second stage of self-determination. The third is beginning to be discussed sometime in the 1990s. Is not quite echoed in many theory of international relation. Normally, they take a position of something like corrective of remedial self-determination. What does that mean? Meaning that they are looking at the more specific and sectoral issues, like determining about resources, about environmental degradation or environmental recovery, and about other sector, including the economic and as well in the political sector. If that happens, then the solution or materialized instrument of old self-determination theory is not going to work. We cannot expect, for example, that self-determination would end up in independent of state. but would likely become how to establish international norm to cooperate in many issues, including, for example, the formation or the creation of a green state, which basically relies on the principle of sharing of responsibility based on cooperation among nations and so on. That would not legitimate to become independent state. So this basically, of course, domestic politics is very important within that context, because this is in modern realist theory. One actually should consider what actually political elite likely be. But and this is very difficult. We don't really know actually what might be happening in Australia. We can consistently think that Liberal Party would always in the government, or there would be emerging another party, for example, Labour Party. If you are looking at the Australian tendency of policy making, especially domestic politics, then there are actually possibilities, but very slim. Whoever in power, irrespective whether they are Liberal power or Labour Party in Australia, they would not adopt this populist approach. They would remain on their own boat with Indonesia, which is basically recognize Papua as a...
So there's self-determination is impossible to do it now, or what you think?
No, it's not possible to do it now. It's not possible. But of course, we must discuss at the governance level, because self-determination and up in independent state, meaning that we are discussing about state entity and state authority. At the same time, we should also discuss at the time of how the state, legitimate state like Indonesian state now, manage both many issues through issues that directly related with governance. What about environmental issues? What about energy issues? What about, say, human rights issues?
Yes,
and
about
so on.
human rights. They now a lot of issues about human rights in Papua, and we know that a lot of NGOs, international NGOs, try to push human rights that it's happened in Papua. What do you think that human rights become the focus or plus point of they to go to self-determination?
Well, we have to understand that there are many categories of human rights. First, of course, is a abuse or violation against non-derigible right. This one is human right generation one, first generation. The two related with some issues, which basically what in the international governance and political right. And the third, of course, is collective rights of people. So most people actually we are discussing now mostly on the first and the second one. If things happen in the first and second, then of course, yeah, it could go international, it becoming international tribunal and so on. But what is the prerequisite of that? One is civil war. The two is that national capacity is very much lacking. If you are looking at here Indonesia within context of Papua and so on, national capacity to handling human rights is more than enough. Considering that we already have National Committee on Human Rights, we already have law regarding human rights trial and human rights protection of human rights, and so on and so forth. Whether this one is sufficient according to international lens is really different ball game. But in fact, at least according to me, Indonesians have national capacity to handle capacity, and in that case, it would not possible to internationalize the issues that Indonesia confront with regard to issue in Papua to become international issues. It's not possible.
It is about a legal aspect, national instrument like about human rights. What do you think that we have enough, strong enough legal issues to counter the human rights internationally?
Well, of course, we must discuss from the larger perspective, including judicial reform on law of the military disciplinary military laws, and so on and so forth. If the question is enough, I guess for now at least, until possibly the next 5 years. But considering that Indonesian also reform is also continue on some aspect, so I would expect then in 2029 we can resolve all this kind of problem related with human rights.
So it's not problem with the legal issue?
No, I don't think that's going to be legal issue. Political issue and diplomatic issue, the answer is yes. And that we must discuss another possibilities, especially chain of government in somewhere outside. For example, whether the Democratic Party would taking power and becoming American president in 2024, what might the government in Xi Jinping would likely to see what the problem in Xinjiang and Tibet, what likely to happen within the United Kingdom, for example, because it's very important. United Kingdom, Benny Wendell gave a lot of support from Jeremy Corbyn, is a Labour Party, but one must note it very carefully. It was supported by Corbyn, is leader of the Labour Party, former leader of political. Now, Labour Party in Britain is in the hand of younger generation.
Yeah, the government of Indonesia now has a lot of policy to develop Papua. As you know, that a lot of Jokowi government try to inform us, make sure that Papua is not special, that Papua is a special autonomy right now. And what you think the government is the right track now to do that?
Honestly speaking, yes. I cannot imagine in a country like Indonesia, with legalized as a unitary state, adopt a policies of giving autonomy to that kind of province in a very short period of time. The thing happening in Belgium need 40 years, in Spain 35 years, and they are not quite successful. In Indonesia, we managed one in quite a short period of time. Of course, there should be some improvement, especially at the implementation level, but the most interesting point in the case of giving autonomy to the Papuan is that what so-called as asymmetric decentralization. That's one thing with regard to the capability that actually the Papuan had, and that is related with how much actually the Indonesian central government provide help, assistance in many form, 2.7%, for example, from the Indonesian national budget to Papuan on annual basis. And third, affirmative approach. You cannot find affirmative approach anywhere, not even.
One more question regarding the military and police activity in Papua. It is possible that human rights violation will take place in Papua, and it become a point for their activities doing that to go to their mission or their intent?
The answer for your first half question is yes. There still is an issue, because actually it's very difficult actually that one between human right on the one hand and warriorship of being a military or police and the other and so on. But the degree of violation would be or could be minimized by many instruments between, for example, chain of command, provide reward and punishments, giving more clear standard operating procedure or how to exercise actually operation, either by the military or by the national police. Then, even if worse thing happen, there will be some mechanism of corrective measure, or even affirmative measure. What, according to me, well, this is a very much personal view, lacking in the military and police is about transparency, I guess. That they do not disclose what they have been doing to their rank and file. It is interesting now when we are looking at what happening in June and July, where a leader of the Indonesian military dismissed a couple of officers actually, because the officer in Papua actually doing something like misbehavior and so on and so forth against the Papuan. I think this kind of thing should be published, should be publicly open. Because otherwise they would not be understood by international community. One of the problems that stimulate NGOs and political activists and diplomats actually to raise this kind of issue, because they think that transparency and accountability regard or corrective measures is actually lacking in the case of Indonesia. If you give that kind of thing, I'm sure that eventually the degree and intensity of protests, of complaint to Indonesia is actually would diminishing as one.
Yes, regarding the media issue of a lot of misinformation about Papua, especially in foreign and abroad. And we know that government tried to counter this issue. What do you think? That is enough now to counter the old issues abroad?
Well, I think we can discuss a lot of issues. One about the approach. I like the terminology that you are using, counter.
Like in a television, how it is good enough to say that the government, they're doing the best of the ability, or
they are trying, but I think there is a lot of room to weight it, to make more effort related with the use of either media or even Indonesian student abroad, a pattern of new political communication with people outside Indonesia, and many issues. Yeah, you should actually do that.
Okay, the last question is regarding the current issues that Benny Wenda and his friend abroad tried to raise the issue of green state vision. What do you think? What do you comment, or do your opinion about this?
I think it's shocking.
Okay.
It's not quite possible actually for Papuan at this state of time will create something like green state. That kind of at the international level, the possibility of one country's success to create green space is that if they relies on cooperation, what I mentioned based on the principle of a sharing of responsibility. Do you think that a new countries, for example, with eligible enough to provide that kind of opportunity, this kind of thing, it's not possible. One particular country that remind me is about Eritrea. Eritrea in 1991 becoming independent state, and so on and so on. And what happened during the last 30 years? Civil war. And in that particular concern, it's not possible actually for the outsider actually to have that kind of country. Then, is it possible for that kind of country, newly independent, based on such determination, like it was the case like Eritrean and so on, began to realize their dream on green state? The answer is no, absolute no. If we are again looking at what might be happening in the next Papua, independent Papua, the first problem in the very first year of independent Papua would be civil war.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. We have a good atmosphere with Professor Dr. Kusnanto Anggoro to brief us about Papuan issue. Thank you very much.